Now we're going to be taking a look at the Architectural Detail tab, which is located under the LWCAD Extended. And you can see that we have a window, a door, and also a fence and add to library tool. And at the end of this chapter, we'll be showing you how to actually create your own windows and doors, and also fence objects. To start out, what I want to do is just create a wall. And I'm going to zoom out just a little bit. And I'm going to create a couple of walls. I also want to make sure, because if you notice, because I zoomed out of our viewport while creating walls, it's going to be almost impossible to get that 90-degree angle. So if I go to the snap panel, I can turn on our angle snap, set it to 90 degrees, and now we can easily just snap our walls into place. And if I open up the numeric, I can go ahead and close our wall just to end that off. Hit the space bar, and now we have a small set of walls. So the first thing we're going to take a look at is our window tool. So I'm going to go ahead and select that, hit N on the keyboard to open up our numeric. I'm also going to change the amount of windows we can see. But if we take a look in the numeric window, we can see all of our available windows that we have. And currently there is balcony windows and basic windows. And you can just select from any one of these available. And now I'm just going to select this W2 window under the basic window. And if we take a look in the perspective view, we can decide where we want to place our windows. And one thing I want to do is just go ahead and click in our perspective view, which will automatically add our window. And there's a little trick we can do to this as well. If you're going to be placing large amounts of windows and you want to have them all lined up, I'm going to hit the space bar and undo this really quick. And what we can do is use the slice tool under drill. So I'm going to select the drill rectangle, hit numeric, and if we set this to slice, what I can just do is slice our wall and give us a line to snap to. In this way, if we go to our snap panel and we make sure that near is on, I'm also going to make sure I turn off angle snap now. But with near on, we'll be able to snap to that bottom line. And if I change this to our wireframe shade mode, we'll be able to see that a little bit better. So we'll go back to our window, open up the numeric for it, and now we can click. And if we select from our bottom, we also want to make sure we have this on fixed currently, and we can just snap to that line. Now the difference between adjustable and fixed is basically the way our handles work. If I set this to adjustable, then when we move our handles on our window, we adjust the actual size. I also have show dimension on so that we can see the actual dimensions of our window. If I set this to fixed, then anytime we click on any of these handles, we're going to be using them just to move around our window. So we can set this in place wherever we like it. And if we right mouse click, it'll bring up our next window that we can set and put in position. Now if you take a look at the top, we have an offset mode. This offset mode determines where exactly our window is going to be placed within the wall. Currently, it's set to 100%. If I set this to user value, we'll be able to set a specific amount. Currently, it's a little over 3 meters. So if we take a look, we can see the offset between our wall and our window is the value that we have set on that offset. If we change that to library mode, then it's going to go to the default value for the specific window that is set in the library. And then we also have a 0%, which in this case is the exact same as our library, where we have our windows on the outside. And if we notice, there's a little bit of a gap on the inside of our window. If we set this to 50%, then it will automatically be in the center of our wall. And if we set this to 100, then it's going to be the exact opposite of 0, where instead of our gap being on the inside, we now have our small gap on the outside. And we can easily adjust our width and our height of our window, either numerically or within the perspective view or any of the other viewports. And one nice thing is having that show dimension option up so that we can actually see how we are adjusting. So we can use the other viewports to size and position, but we typically want to use the perspective view for actually placing our windows because it's a lot easier and a lot faster. Okay, so I'm going to hit the spacebar, and let's take a look at our door tool, which works exactly the same way as our window tool. We'll open up the numeric for that, and we can select one of our doors. And now we can click in our perspective view to set that initial door. And now, making sure we're on the fixed option, I'm going to select one of our bottom handles and just snap to the near and one of our bottom lines. We also have the same offset modes available for the door that we have for our windows. So we can set this to 0%, 100, or 50 to make it right in the center of our wall. And we can switch this between adjustable and fixed in order to change the dimension of our door or our wall. So it works exactly the same way as our window tool. And it's a very quick and easy way to add doors and windows to our scene. Also note that we can add windows to other objects as well. For instance, if I was going to create a roof for this, so let's go to our Architectural Basic tab, select Roof, and I'm just going to pull out our roof, and I want to position it on the top. I'm going to go to our numeric and just give this an outside extrude mode, and you can see we're extending quite a bit. So what I can do is just scale that in a little, because of course this house isn't exactly proportion, and that looks like that should be good. If we want, we can slice this roof as well for placement for windows. So we can select our drill tool, drill rectangle, making sure we're in the slice mode, and we can just easily slice the top of our roof wherever we want our windows to be. So now if we go back, select our window tool, we can go ahead and click on our roof, and we can see that it automatically will adjust our window to the correct position. Open up the numeric, and we can snap that to that line. We could also adjust the width and the height if needed. And then we could just snap that back in place. So it's a very quick and easy way to add windows and doors, and we can do it to the roof objects as well as many other objects as well. And if I want, I could just right mouse click and click once again on our object to place a new window. Now it's usually a good idea to figure out exactly what sizes you need ahead of time, and working on specific library objects before you go ahead and work on a very specific scene to make sure that you have all of your windows in the correct dimensions, and that way you don't have to reposition and size them with every window you create. And we'll be covering that a little bit later. But first, I'm just going to clear out our scene, and now let's take a look at our fence tool. So I'm going to go ahead and select fence, open up the numeric. You can see we have a lot of different options: wooden fences and metal fences. Now you notice we have two different sets, and that's because we have both the fence shapes and the column shapes. If I turn off column, then it's not going to be active, but let's go ahead and just draw something out really quick so you can see exactly how that reacts. With every point that I'm going to create, and I want to make sure I turn off that angle snap, every point is going to be a post. And we can snap to the end if we needed to. And I'm just going to hit the spacebar and end that for right now. Open this up in the perspective view, and we can see this a little bit better. And you can see we have a post selected in every single area that we created an endpoint. Now what we could also do is select create points and in between values and set exactly where our posts are going to be. And I'm going to undo that and go back and select our fence tool once again. Go back to the numeric options, and you see if we turn off column, we can see that all of our posts are gone from our fence, and we just have that shape from the first library. We can also change these while it's already drawn out. So we don't need to worry about creating a fence and not liking it. What we can easily do is just switch between the available both columns and our dividers or in-between values. And you can see that a lot of these are sized a little bit differently. And in this case, there's really no way to modify the height of those columns because those are based on the actual dimensions in which the objects were made. But for the most part, you'll be able to pretty much see exactly which ones go together, if not just by trial and error. But you can usually, just by sticking in the same libraries for the most part, get very similar fences for what you need. We change these to the wooden fences. You can see we have a couple of different column options. And then also all the different types of in-between posts we can create, and the actual fence itself. But it's a very useful tool, not only for creating fences, but creating a variety of different things. Because essentially it's a cloning tool. So if you create an object that you need to define by certain lines, you can actually develop and design very interesting objects for quick creation. And now we're going to take a look at creating custom windows and doors, and also fence objects. So I'm going to start out just by creating a box. We're going to create a window. And I'm just going to size this down so it's not a gigantic window. And then I'm going to switch over to the drill options and just use D-rectangle. And I also want to turn off our snapping options just so that I can position this correctly. And that should be good. And I'm just going to go ahead and turn those back on when we get to the other features. And really quick, I'm just going to add another box in the inside, which is going to represent our window, or actual glass in the window. And then I also want to give these surface names. So I'm just going to call this one trim. And I'm going to call the other one glass. Now if you're working with multiple objects, you may want to call that window underscore trim and then window underscore glass. But for right now, I'm just going to keep those the way they're at. So now I can cut this glass object and paste it in there. And I'm also going to use a tool that I haven't covered just yet, but it is in the next chapter, and that's the engraver tool. And I just want to use that really quick to give us a nice looking trim with some nice shapes and profiles. But the first thing I need to do before I can use the engraver is to split our polygons so that we have 4-point polygons. So I'm just selecting these 2 points, making sure that our polygon is still selected, and in point mode, select those 2 points where I want to make that cut and the split inside of our polygon, and I'm just going to hit Control L. Now if we take a look back in the polygons, we can see that we have all 4-point polygons, and they're all convex. I'm going to switch over to our LWCAD Extended tab, and under Polygon Detail, I'm going to select our engraver. And I'm just going to click and pull that out. And I'm just going to stick with the default shape layer just for right now. And like I said, in the next chapter I'll be covering this tool, and you'll be able to see all the cool things that it can do. I also want to open up just our surface editor, and I'm going to change our materials for our glass. Just going to set that to more of a blue color, change our transparency to just 90%, should be fine. Maybe add a little bit of specularity. Minimal reflection. And the glossiness I'll go up to about 68. And then for our trim, we just want sort of a wood color. So I'll just grab more of a brown towards more of the gray section. This is more of an older wood. And now we can see that that engraving that I made is actually with our glass surface. So I'm just going to select all of our polygons that are not the glass and reassign that to the trim. Okay, so now we have our basic object. We could add pretty much whatever we want to this. If I wanted to, I could add maybe some bars in there or a little trim accents. But I'm just going to stick with this and get a basic idea. And now the first thing I want to do is I'm going to hit Y on the keyboard to open up our rotation options. And if you hold down Shift and just move that, or Control to constrain our rotation, that way we'll make sure that we have a perfect 90-degree angle. You could also use the Snap Rotate tool for that. And I'm also going to hit F2, which is my default, and most defaults for the center tool. I'm just going to raise that a little bit off of our plane. And now we just have one last thing to do before we can actually save this out as a window and put this into our library. And what we need to do is define the outer area of our window by using an LWCAD curve. I'm just going to do this in another layer for right now. And what I'll end up doing is just pasting that into our first layer. But I'm going to go to our first LWCAD tab and select our rectangle tool under primitives. And with our snapping tools on, I want to make sure I snap from one corner to the other corner. And now this creates our curve that is going to define the outer edges of our window, and also its placement in relation to where the wall is. So I'm going to move this to the center, and that way we're more in the center of the wall. If I was to move this curve down farther, then when we create this window, the offset will be the distance between our actual object and the wall would be represented by this LWCAD curve that we have. So if I increase that amount, then our offset will be increased. Although we could still always change that within the user panel. I'm going to drag that up and put that about a little bit under center. And that should be good. So I'm going to cut this, Control X from our second layer, and Control V to paste it into our first layer. And now our object is defined. And this is the same method we would use for creating a door. And we always want to make sure, too, that we do this rotation so that we're looking at the object from above. Because if we do it from the sides, then it's not going to turn out correctly, and LWCAD will not import it correctly. So now we have our object ready. What we can do is go to our LWCAD Extended tab, and then under our architectural detail, we can select Add to Library. And we get an error, and if I open up the numeric options, that's because our target library is currently set to column, which is part of the fence, and the curve that is needed to create fences and columns are a little bit different, and those require just a 2-point curve. With a window, we need a 4-point. So go back to that window, and if we select window, then we're able to define with our existing curve, and we can also see that it's highlighted in blue in our viewport, and that's showing our outside area. Also, if you look into our browser and we take a look at all the different window options, we can currently see that, well, I'll change this to our basic windows too. You can see our highlighted areas for all of these windows, and that's the LWCAD curve defining the outer areas of each of these different windows. So the first thing we want to do is select the library that we'd like to add this to. If you want, you can create a new library. I'm going to call this Custom, and click OK. Now we have our custom library, and we want to select our new shape name, whatever we want to call the window, and I'm just going to call this Window 001. And once that's ready, we can click Add Shape. Now once it's added to the library, we can actually use a couple of these different tools. We can flip it horizontally if we wanted, and we can also flip it vertically. And that way we have a little bit of extra editing while still within the library editor. This works the same for the doors as well. And if you really want, you can also hit just the delete shape, which will allow us to remove that shape from the library. So now that it's added to our LWCAD library, I am going to delete this. And actually, I'll just leave it in that first layer, just in case. And I'm going to select our wall tool under Architectural Basic, and just create a simple wall. Also want to turn back on, go to our snap panel, make sure those are on. I'm going to turn on our angle snap at 90 and just undo that current wall that I had created and create another one. And that should be good. Also, I'm going to change the material and just assign this as wall. Now what we can do is go to our architectural detail, select window, click to make our window, open the numeric, change our library to custom, which we just created, and now we have our window in there. You can also see that this is stretched and doesn't quite look right. So I'm going to undo this, go back to our window. Now that we have it selected before we actually chose our custom window, and click and create the object. And now it's proportioned correctly, because it will fit into other windows when we change them. So that's one thing to keep in mind. If we take a look, we can see that our window is basically on the outside of our cut. So what we can do is either modify that line that we had created, or that 4-point curve, to define our window, and we can see that we have a snapping option where that line was created. We can see that right here. So I'm just going to switch this to user. We can also see that we can switch between our different options as well. If I set this to 0%, then we're basically inside of the wall for the most part. But if I want to bring that in further, go back to our user, and then we can just adjust our offset to make this go inside of our wall. We can also adjust our width and our height in the numeric panel to change our options for this window as well. I'm going to go ahead and right mouse click and re-click into our viewport, And we can see, since we're still in the fixed option, that it does remember the changes that we had made. So now I just added 2 of our windows to this wall. And you can see it's really quite easy to customize your own windows and make them, which makes making houses a lot easier. And in LWCAD 2.5, you'll find yourself being able to create a lot more elaborate models in about half of the time, if not quicker, than you were with 2.0 or 2.1. Now, doors are created in the exact same fashion. In order to create a door, you just have to model it, and you just want to make sure that you add that 4-point curve using the rectangle tool under the primitives to define the outer sides of your door. And that's really all you need to do. So it works exactly the same as the window. So now let's move on and take a look at creating custom fence objects. So I'm just going to delete the current objects that we have. Now the first thing I'm going to work on is the sections of the fence and the actual fence itself, and then we'll do the posts afterwards. And one thing to keep in mind is that you do want to keep this basically in the correct measurements, especially with the fence tool, because the fence tool, you're really not able to change its size very easily, at least not as easily as you would with the window and the door tool. So typically when you're modeling fence objects, you want to make sure they're the correct size. I'm just going to use a basic size and make the fence around 2 meters. I'm going to start out just by creating another box, and I'm just going to use the standard Lightwave tools for this. We'll just pull that out. And I'm going to add 2 divisions by using the right arrow key. And this is going to help us define the dog-eared parts at the top of the fence. And I'm just going to drag these out a little. And now I want to select our side points, hit T to move, and just move that down a little. Now, the amount of polygons in what sort of designs you'd like to do is entirely up to you, although you may want to keep your polygon level down to a certain extent, because you'll find that with really high polygon levels, it'll be difficult to create very long fence links. So one thing I'm going to do, just to remove these extra polys that we have in here that we really don't need, is just select them and hit Shift-Z. And what that's going to do is merge our polygons together, because we don't need them to be 3 polygons in these sections. We really only need 1. And that'll also help us define our bevel, because I do want to bevel this just to add that bit of realism if we were to render this, and that way we get that little bit of highlight. And it's always a good idea to just add that little bit of a bevel to basically every object that you create. And it doesn't have to be a large bevel. It could be a small one. I'm just going to go with about a medium-sized bevel, but just enough to see that initial bit of highlight on the edges. And now what I'm going to do is set up our in-between posts, and I'm just going to go to another layer for that, or not so much our posts, but our connectors for our fence. So I'm just going to create another box. I'm going to remove our segments. And we just want to pull this out a bit. And I'm going to zoom in. And we just want to make sure that looks right. And I'm going to make this a bit thinner. So I'm going to zoom in a little bit more. And just pull that in. Now we also want to make sure that this is not too wide, because if it's too wide, we're going to have a lot of spacing in between each of our segments for our fence. So I'm going to hit H on the keyboard to bring up our stretch tool. And under our modes in the lower right corner, if you're using a more or higher resolution than I am, which you probably are, then that will be more towards the center of the bottom of the screen. But I'm going to change this to selection, and that way we're not limited by where the mouse is actually positioned, but rather what polygons we have selected. I'm going to hit T on the keyboard just to move that up. And now I'm going to Control C and Control V to copy and paste. And now I still have the Move tool activated, so I'm just going to move that pasted object, or the initially selected object, because the pasted object is actually the top one that got left behind. So now if we wanted, we could add bolts to secure these together. We could add as much detail as we want, but I'm just going to stick with something basic right now. And that looks pretty good. All I really want to do now is just add that bit of that bevel. So I'm going to delete our side polygons because we don't need them. Because all of our fences sections are going to be connected at these points right here as if they were mirroring each other, and kind of like how the vector clone works. So we don't really need those polygons in the scene. And I'm just going to bevel this outward. But one thing we want to make sure that we do is that we don't have the bevel going off on the sides. And if we take a look at our sides of our object, we can see that they are. So what I'm going to do is just select our points, H2 stretch, and I'm still in selection mode, so this is just going to bring everything to the center. I'm going to deselect those points, select our other sets of points. We'll do the same thing. And now I'm actually just going to delete the bottom one and recopy and paste, just so that I don't have to do that over again. It's much faster. Okay, so that should be pretty good for our fence section. And all we need to do now is hit Y on the keyboard, hold down Shift or Control to constrain, or use the middle mouse button. And I'm just going to move that into position. And now what we need to do is just define a 2-point curve. So I'm going to go to LWCAD, and I just want to select the line tool. And I'm going to snap from one end to the other. And I'm just going to leave it at that. If I wanted, actually, I could move that down to the bottom, which would probably be a better idea, because then what will happen is it will move and our fence will be positioned correctly. So I'm going to redraw that line in another viewport. And now I'm going to put the other ones in the background, hit T to move, and just move that down to the bottom. And I'm going to bring it up just a little bit higher, because if we're going to be placing this on any sort of a terrain, then we're going to need to make sure that it can go a little bit into the ground. But depending on the type of fence, you might actually want it to go just a little bit above the ground, because most fences usually do, and it's the posts that you're really going to want to go into the ground. But it really depends on the style that you're going for and what it is you're trying to create. So now what I want to do is just select all of these in the same layer, and I'm going to hit Control and X to cut, and just select our first layer and then paste that in there using Control V. We also have the copy and paste options on the bottom as well. And if you want, you can define your surface for this. Although there's definitely one thing to keep in mind, and that is that when we save these objects to our library, it does not save any texture files or any major parts of the surface that are really part of that object. So you really want to do your texturing afterwards because LWCAD will not remember the actual material information if you are going to add any sorts of textures to it. So now what we can do is go back to our LWCAD Extended tab, and under Architectural Detail, I will click Add to Library, and we're going to get that error again. A frame curve must be closed. It's a different error this time, but that's because we still have the window selected. So if we open up the numeric options, select Fence, and now we can see that is correct. So I'm going to define a custom library. So I'm going to click Create Library, call this Custom, click OK, and then I'm just going to call this fence_001, and then add the shape. And then we can see a nice little preview, and depending on our preview row amount, we can see a larger preview, and that should be good for our fence. Go ahead and close that out. Now we're going to keep this in a background layer and just design the area for our post. And one thing, a really good thing to do is just keep this in the background layer so you have a good idea of your size, because you do not want them to be different sizes, because it will remember the scale that you create them at. And if we have an object that is not proportionate to each other, then we'll end up with really large fence posts and small actual fence segments. So now we have just a basic post. I'm going to go ahead and bevel the end out just to make it a little more interesting. And then I'm going to re-bevel the entire object just a tiny amount so that we can have that extra bit of shading. And then if we want, we can assign a material to it, or do anything that we want. We could maybe use the drill tools to cut out sections and make it a little more interesting looking, a little more intricate. But I'm going to keep this the way it is right now and select our poly that we had created, or our curve, our 2-point curve for our fence section. Copy that and paste that onto our post layer. I also have this line a little bit above the post so that if we wanted to, we could have that going in the ground. And I am actually going to move that down just a little bit further. And if we were going to be working with a very uneven terrain, then you might want to customize your posts to go just a little bit further than that. Now another thing we need to do is resize this. And the easiest way to do that is just to open our snap panel under LWCAD Extended. Just select Near, and then I'm going to select Drag Snap. I'm going to just turn these sections off, and I'm just going to go in there and actually do this manually. I'm going to use the regular drag tool just to get them into a basic position. And now I'm going to select this point and use Move Snap this time. Open the Snap panel, select Near. And just snap that to that section. Go to the other point, Move Snap, and just snap that in. So now that is defined, and what we can do is go to our architectural detail, our architecture detail, and click Add to Library. And on the keyboard to pull up our numeric options, we're going to select column this time. We're going to create a new library, which I'm just going to call custom once again. And I'm just going to call this post_001. Add it to the library. I can close that out now. And now I'm going to open up a new layer. We're going to select our fence tool. Under numeric, we want to select our shapes that we've created. And now we can click and draw out our fence. And I'm going to turn off our angle snap. And I'm going to click actually closed fence just to complete that last section. And if we take a look further down our numeric panel, we can see that we have individual options for both our fence preview rows and our column preview rows. And we can also show our dimensions and angles as well. Go ahead and close that out. Hit the space bar. I'm going to hit the 0 key on the number pad just to expand our perspective view, and we can take a look at our fence. Now you can see that we probably have a little bit too much spacing in between each of our different segments. So what we could easily do to fix that is just pull in these areas on the sides and maybe just make it a very small amount. It doesn't need that much distance, but it really depends on, of course, the look that you want. Also, if you take a look, you notice that the fence is basically inside out in a way, meaning that we have our post connections on the outside instead of on the inside. So what we could easily do is just flip around that object that we had created and resave it out, which would probably be one of the easiest ways to do that, and then just redraw our fence object.